April 1806. In a private house in Dublin, Ireland, Major General Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, was getting married. He had just returned from 9 successful years in India and claimed the hand of his former sweetheart, Kitty Pakenham. But the marriage was to be a curious one, for the fire that burned in Wellesley's heart was not for his wife, but for his dream of proving himself a great military commander. Over the next decade, the pursuit of this dream would bring him fame and fortune beyond his wildest expectations. Arthur Wellesley had fallen in love with Kitty Pakenham when he was a junior officer with no prospects. Kitty's family had wanted better for her and rejected him. Now at 37, Wellesley was a wealthy general. The Pakenhams blessed the union. The entry in the register is still visible. The Honourable Sir Arthur Wellesley, Knight of the Bath, to the Honourable Catherine Sarah Dorothea Pakenham of this parish. 10th of April, 1806. When these lines were written, Kitty and Arthur had just set eyes on one another for the first time in 11 years. Kitty tried to persuade Arthur to see her before committing himself to the marriage. But he insisted that it wasn't necessary.
Of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God.
When they finally met in the drawing room of the Pakenham's house in Dublin, shortly before the ceremony, Arthur exclaimed to his brother, "She's grown ugly, by Jove." It was a bad start to what was to prove an unhappy marriage. Since they had last met, Arthur had spent a decade in India, winning a string of victories. Kitty had spent those years in near isolation in rural Ireland. Their experiences, once so similar, were now worlds apart. Increasingly, Arthur made Kitty nervous, and she irritated him. So why had Arthur married Kitty? Her family had turned him down years before. But he had promised her that his feelings would remain unchanged, and she had waited for him. I think that a sense of honour, not the quest for personal happiness, was what took him to the altar. But once married, neither that sense of honour nor the birth of 2 sons could make him want to stay by Kitty's side. Instead, he longed for a return to active service and the chance to make a name for himself on the European stage.
I would be very sorry to stay at home while others went abroad. I am ready to be sent to any part of the world at a moment's notice.
The time was ripe. Britain was living under threat from France. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, had set out to subjugate Western Europe. He had been terrifyingly successful. By the summer of 1807, the French Empire extended from the English Channel to the heart of Central Europe. The following winter, Napoleon seized control of Spain and Portugal. Wellesley's break came when Spanish and Portuguese delegates arrived in London, asking for British help against the occupying French armies. Arthur Wellesley was given the command of a force destined for Portugal. It was the beginning of a journey that would make him one of the most famous men in Europe and ultimately win him the title Duke of Wellington. Before he set out, Wellesley had a farewell dinner at his London home, 11 Harley Street. At the end of the meal, he confided to a friend,
I am thinking of the French that I'm going to fight. They have, it seems, a new system of strategy which has outmaneuvered and overwhelmed all the armies of Europe. But if what I hear of their system is true, I suspect all the Continental armies were more than half beaten before the battle was begun. I, at least, will not be frightened beforehand.
This lack of fear, this refusal to be browbeaten, was to prove one of Wellesley's greatest assets. Fired with enthusiasm for command, Arthur Wellesley arrived in Portugal on the 30th of July, 1808. There he found a letter waiting for him. It contained disastrous news.
It said that the French army under General Junot was much bigger than had been believed, and that reinforcements were being sent out to the British army. Then came the infuriating bit. Because the British army would be bigger, it needed more senior commanders, and two generals, both of them much older than Wellesley, were already en route. Wellesley's response showed characteristic impatience with authority and thirst for reputation. I hope that I will have beat Junot before any of them arrive. After that, they will do as they please with me.
He then issued a proclamation to the Portuguese.
People of Portugal, the time has arrived to rescue your country.
But before Wellesley could engage Junot in battle, Sir Harry Burrard, one of the commanders who was due to supersede him, arrived offshore. Wellesley met him with a battle plan. Sir Harry rejected it and insisted they should do nothing until more British troops arrived. Like almost everyone else, he was decidedly cautious about the French. But Burrard's decision was overtaken by events. Wellesley had established his headquarters in the village of Vimeiro. Just after midnight, he heard that the French were marching to attack. With Sir Harry still out at sea, Wellesley remained in charge. Soon he had his British and Portuguese troops in position.
Here on this slope, outside Vimeiro village, Wellesley's troops met the French for the first major battle of his command. It was here that he used tactics that he was convinced would beat the French. Tactics which were to characterize so much of the war. They brought together his own eagle eye for the ground, his painstaking study of French methods, and his insistence on training and discipline.
Wellesley's study of French tactics had convinced him that their methods had a serious flaw. The French concentrated on terrifying their opponents. They made a lot of noise and marched forward in densely packed columns. But although the column might burst its way through an enemy by sheer physical shock, it was not much use for delivering musket fire, because only the first 2 or 3 lines could shoot. Wellesley believed that the key to victory was to surprise the French and then outshoot them. He positioned his troops behind the crest of a hill and arranged them in a long line. As the French approached, the British line would step forward, as if from nowhere, and open fire.
The French problem was simple. They could see very little until they crossed the ridge, and then it was far too late. The column that came up the slope here had about 30 men in front and was 42 men deep. Just over there was a British line of about 800 men. Those 800 British muskets were firing 4 times a minute. All morning, French column met British line right across the battlefield. And every time, the columns fell back in disarray.
Wellesley was delighted. He had proved that he could beat the French. They had sustained over 2,000 casualties, while Wellesley had lost only 700 men. He encouraged Sir Harry Burrard, who'd now arrived at the battlefield, to turn victory into a rout.
Sir Harry, now is your time to advance. The enemy are completely beaten. We shall be in Lisbon in 3 days.
But once again, to Wellesley's exasperation, Sir Harry refused to act.